inviting me as well. We're going to rush through this next panel. We are going to be very, very quick. I've already asked our panelists to speak for 5 to 7 minutes and take questions at the very end of the panel. So we'll do that. Brief introductions, alphabetically. Ahije, Evelyn Ahije, University of Surrey, doctoral degree. I should be calling her Dr. Evelyn. Civil-based asset forfeiture regime. US has one, so I'm anxious to hear what she has to say. Non-practicing solicitor in England and Wales. Again, very impressive panel. Ms. Wambui Karaoke, Catholic University of Eastern Africa, Diploma of Public Management, University of Chile, teaches at the Strathmore Law School, teaching fellow, written on urban transport choice. Dr. Joyce Malala, lecturer at Ascot University Law School, especially interested in regulation and supervision. I believe her first book on mobile regulation is just coming out, first of its kind, subject which I find particularly interesting. Sandra Mututi, Masters of Applied Philosophy from Strathmore University, Nairobi, teaching philosophy and ethics at Strathmore. And I'm missing one person. We have a latecomer, and I apologize, but somehow, wait a minute, I have it here. No, I don't have it. I apologize because we had a late addition. I'm going to ask Joy and her co-panelists to go first because I know she has some other obligations. Joy?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I think Wambui will begin for 5 minutes. Just to give a caveat, this is a working paper, a research we intend to carry out. So we are still in the workshop stage, but we thought it would fit into this theme of financial crime and African perspective, looking at the transport industry. Take it away, Wambui.
All right, thank you very much, Ross. Thank you, Joy. So just giving a perspective or a background of how transport happens in Nairobi. You can see here we have a modal split where a majority of the people in Nairobi and the larger Kenya use buses and minivans, which we call matatus, to commute and to move around. So by research taken by Deloitte in 2019, showed that 46% of us use public means for commuting around the city, for work trips and other trips as well. A lot of the countries in this area are characterized by what we call informal transport, which has a lot of mid-sized vehicles running on semi-flexible routes and not very fixed schedules or stops and very little public support. They usually operate purely for business and on a small scale with private ownerships of these vehicles. And this is what is also very common in a lot of the developing countries, including Kenya itself, right? The second mode that is very commonly used is walking, which is 39%. And this is common with people of the lower income bracket as well as the middle class. And 13% have their own car ownership. We can move to the next slide, please. Right, so in terms of the scenery of the transport within the city, we do have 46%, which is, as I have mentioned earlier, and which is informal and forms up to 50% of transport on major corridors. They're very competitive in nature as they are privately owned and for profit. We can move to the next slide. As I've said previously, the minivans that we use mostly are called matatus. And just to introduce a lot of stakeholders within this industry, we can see a few images we have here from the Naipolitans, which does a lot of work in urban transport within Nairobi and within the larger Kenya. And here we can see that there are a lot of players in this particular sector, including drivers, conductors, casual drivers and conductors, people who move the passengers into the vehicles. We have also touts, stage clerks, vendors, ladies who sell lunch and other meals to the Matatu crew, and also the mechanics and all these other people who form the whole ecosystem. And interesting to note is that this whole ecosystem, as the Matatu industry started off in 1973, which was now serving the African population and creating transport for that segment of the society at that point in time, which was illegal at that point. So prior to 1973, they operated illegally as a need for transport for the Africans, the natives during the colonial period. And the word matatu comes from the word 30 cents, which was this flat standard fee that was used at that particular time, which has since increased. And it was quite a monopoly in its time. It is characterized with high corruption among the crew, the Matatu crew, as well as the police in this sphere. So it is characterized as massive corruption, poor quality equipment, and impracticability. Around 2010, they had tried to streamline the sector by creating sort of an organizing system where they were all required to be in savings and credit cooperatives, called SACCOs, which had modeled around intercity matatus moving from one county to another. And this, in a bid to regulate the industry, they created a system which most matatus were required to be operating under SACCOs just to create a lot more order in the system. And prior to that, they were required to get a transport license from the Transport Licensing Board, which was separate. And as time went along, it created a National Transport and Safety Authority by an act of parliament in October 2012. And this entity was mandated to sort of streamline the whole process of the matatu sector, the public transport. And this created a bit of order in the space. The next slide, please. So in terms of the corruption and financial crime that occurs in the transport sector, we have state actors as well as non-state actors. And in the state actors, a report by Transparency International showed that the highest or the most corrupt state entity are the Kenya Police in terms of corruption and bribery. And 60 to 93% of the respondents said they were likely to give bribes to the police officers. And you can see there that we have the highest percentage, which is 22%, going or attributed to the police. In the same breath, we have also that matatus should ideally go through inspection, but a lot of times during this inspection, which is done by also state actors, they are able to give bribes, and as much as the vehicle is not roadworthy, they will still be allowed to be on the road, and they are able to operate. At any one point, due to this oversight by the regulators, a police officer can stop a matatu and find anything, and will definitely find something wrong with the vehicle and a justification to have a bribe. And a lot of the crew prefer not to engage or not to move forward and have it in a judicial process. They would rather just pay the police officer to move forward. And the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, in their quarterly report of 2018, found that numerous of the cases that they were looking at of grand corruption had to do with a lot of police officers who were taking bribes from matatu crew and also personal vehicles, as well as long distance trucks, right? That didn't need to, that would avoid paying or avoid any inspection so that they can proceed with their journeys. In the Business Today 2019, during a meeting by the Matatu Owners Association, they claimed that they were losing Kenya shillings 900 million a month to corruption, which is quite a big amount. And this money was being paid to cartels, criminal gangs, transport actors, rogue traffic officers, dishonest National Transport Authority officers, and crafty county officials, including the county governments within the cities. And also in 2002, there was a report that said that 40% of the matatus on the road were owned by the police and also other state actors, including politicians. We can move to the next slide. So a summary of the state actors in this space include the officers, the judicial officers, the Kenya Police, regulators such as the National Transport Safety Authority, employees, and public officers such as politicians and other actors in that space. So here you can see, despite the efforts by the judiciary aimed at discouraging corruption in traffic matters, most participants, that is 80% of long distance drivers, 86% of matatu drivers, 86% of bodas, which are the motorcycles within the cities used for public transport, and 89% of taxi drivers indicated that they preferred to resolve matters outside the court due to collision at the courts. We can move to the next slide. In terms of non-state actors in this include such vigilante groups such as the Mungiki, which is a youth-led vigilante group that had grown in notoriety for a lot of violent crimes that were happening, especially prior to 2010. And in 2007, there was a shoot to kill order by the then Minister for Security, which led to a decline in their presence, and they were the ones who were controlling a lot of the routes. So in terms of access to routes, a lot of these cartels would demand for payment, and they would have to pay 200 shillings or thereabouts of $2 every morning and every evening to be allowed to gain access to the route or to operate every day. So this is a lot of lost revenue that was going to fund these violent groups. And now since there was the shoot to kill order and there was a reduction in the presence of the Mungiki, there is also a neighborhood group called the Kamjesh, which is also an informal gathering or an informal organization of a youth who collect also money to be able to allow the matatus to operate within these routes. So these route cartels also charge for operation within the routes. And in a paper that I cite heavily, by Ference of 2021, the payouts to the police and gangs vary depending on the route, but can cost up to $8 or more a day. And refusal to pay can come with dire consequences, including burning the vehicles, death of the matatu operators, and other severe consequences. The next slide, please. In terms of regulating the sector to control or to ensure that funding is not lost or revenue that should be collected, such as taxes and payments for other services, such as inspection and fines that are collected. The National Transport and Safety Authority has tried to harmonize a lot of processes that were previously held in sort of silos in different departments. For getting the driver's license, getting the license for the vehicle was formerly with the Kenya Revenue Authority. The police would also do the inspections for vehicles. And so this has been all consolidated under the National Transport Security and Safety Agency. However, there are still a few loopholes within the system where officials request for bribes to be able to process a lot of these systems that are required, or they would request for a bribe to overlook a lot of flaws that are found in the vehicle or even in terms of licensing. So previously, the fragmented services and the manual processes created loopholes, and there was a thriving underworld of cartels that would create a lot of illicit financial flows. However, as the matatu ecosystem is very fast, as I have explained in the previous slide, it requires, or the crew generally requires, to have a very financial system, hence a lot of hesitance in terms of moving towards a cashless system, which would be able to identify the exact revenue that is being collected. So there has been a lot of attempts to try and make this whole system, the payment system, cashless, but there's a lot of resistance from both sides, from the police and also from the crew.
Bowie, I apologize, but we are getting on in time. Could I ask you to get to your conclusions, please?
All right, thank you, Ross. Next slide. Right, so in terms of how the transport sector is organized in terms of the legal framework, we have the Constitution of Kenya, the Public Officers Ethics Act, the Kenya Bribery Act, which Joy will take over to discuss, the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes, the National Police Service Act, that requires how the police should carry themselves, the National Police Service Commission Act, the Kenya Traffic Act, the Transport Licensing Act, and the National Transport and Safety Authority Act. So in conclusion, there is quite a bit of money that is lost to corruption, and essentially which affects a lot of the local Kenyans, the everyday users. And as we have seen, a lot of these transport modes are used by people who are of lower income brackets. And if a lot of the inspection is not done well, a lot of the licensing is not done well, it leads to a situation where we have a lot of unroadworthy vehicles on the road and accidents. And at a higher scale, in terms of regulating the whole area, the transport network, we have the situation where we have kickbacks being given within the line ministries in terms of the construction of the road, which eliminates a lot of necessary provisions such as cycling and walkways for pedestrians and cyclists. All right, and that's my conclusion. I'll hand over to Joy right now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for still being engaged this late in the day. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to take you briefly, very briefly, in an elevator pitch style presentation, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about has been reinforced and reinstated and reaffirmed by many of the speakers already. But as I said, this is a working paper and a research that we're trying to put together about how we've been talking a lot about legal transplants and adapting international standards that are not fit for purpose and do not sort of embolden the nuances that Global South countries have. And we wanted to look at the transport industry because it represents the intersection of the citizen and the institution. So we are sort of trying to address the institutionality of applying the law, that we have a set of rules that are instituted, and then we expect society to comply, but there's a misstep when the people who are tasked to enforce the law are the rule breakers. So in this sense, we're talking about how the police extort from the citizens, and it basically, we're looking at grassroots bribery. So the next slide, please. The next one. So this is the context, that at the point at which citizens encounter bribery is through state actors or people who are instituted to enforce the law, such as the police. They extort motorists on various occasions, either flouting traffic offenses or non-compliance of rules, or basically the whole gambit of extortion and bribery. So what happens is there's a fear of the court process, which is a catalyst to the upsurge in graft cases. And because the court process takes a very long time, then we are then forced to bribe our police officers. Next slide. So what governs bribery in Kenya is the Bribery Act, which was enforced in 2016. The act defines what bribery is, but there is no, the universal sort of definition is accepting payment for favor, right? But how we understand it is accepting payment and giving payment for convenience. It's the price we pay for convenience. So that's what basically bribery is defined. But this act was modeled under the UK Act, almost word for word, without the nuances of culture and context. So the other regulatory framework is the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Act and the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, and the other legislative instruments that Wambui has previously mentioned. Next slide, please. So the implementation challenges are brought about by, again, as I said, the legal transplantation, and a way for us to sort of model policies that account for our own circumstances. Because if I was to explain to you how the matatu industry works or the transport industry works, it would be very difficult to model the transport policy from the UK into the Kenyan system in order to tackle bribery, because it just would not work. So that's part of the implementation challenge. There's also a lack of nuanced approach to cultural underpinnings and a sort of imposition of Orientalism standards that we look at our situations and model them to other situations that do not necessarily apply. Next slide, please. The possible solutions we are hoping to find or to model are not just law approach, because we are seeing that regulations are not enforced, they're not implemented, they're not followed, they're not safeguarded, they're not upheld. We're looking at a citizen-centered approach to bribery, because it is bribery is about individual exchanges, and it's an undercurrent and it's a language of oppression, because the police occupy a position of power, and the people who use matatus or the transport industry in Kenya are people from unequal backgrounds. So we are also proposing privatization of accredited checkpoints on roads, which is a point at which bribery occurs. We're also proposing standardization of levies and perhaps looking at shortcut probation times, because that's an additional pain point. Next. And I think Sandra will take us through the ethics behind corruption, which we're trying to use as a solution to these problems. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Joy. So the next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So I'll just begin from picking up from what Joy talked about. Is it possible for us to look at a citizen-based approach? And I looked at three broad philosophers who give motivations as to why we can be moral and why the citizen can actually implement what we need to have a moral or an uncorrupt world. So for Aristotle, he talks about looking for eudaimonia, which is happiness. And happiness can be found by living a good life, which is a virtuous life. So there's motivation for the citizen, for the person, for the individual to actually live a good life, because to live a virtuous life because it leads to a good life. Then we have Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, who spoke about the social contract, that in return for us giving up part of our freedoms, the society serves us. So it only makes sense that if we want to receive good from society, we also do good within the society for us to have a cohesive society. So there is motivation again for us to be moral, for us to have good behavior, because we have sort of signed the social contract. Then we have Kant, and Kant is very black and white. He speaks about duty as the right thing to do. So he speaks about duty or doing the right thing or being moral because it is what you are meant to do, not because of anything else. And so these three, who are very have the very different perspectives, do all point to the fact it is possible for us as citizens, and in Kenya specifically, to have good behavior. So what makes us unable to have good behavior? So next slide, please. So when you look at corruption in the African context, what we find is that we as citizens, and I'm speaking about the transport industry in particular, we come to rely on connections and favors as opposed to the formal political, social, and economic rules. That corruption and the inefficiencies created by corruption create that inevitable facet of life. So the more the public sector becomes dysfunctional, then the more we rely on corruption as a way of life. And you would think that it would dissuade us from being corrupt. But you find, like, even in the transport industry, as a citizen who, for example, drives a car, when you have broken a law, it is easier to bribe a policeman than it is for you to go to court. But why is that? Why is that true? And we know that we abhor corruption as an immoral thing. Why then does it become our first step when we want to get out of bad things? So next slide, please. Yeah, so we find, first of all, and I think Joy and Mambo have both spoken about this, that we do have a lot of anti-corruption reforms. Yeah, we have strong legal reforms. We have a lot of good framework. But the problem is translating these laws into practice. Yeah, so it seems sometimes that these anti-corruption reforms not only fail to prevent corrupt activities, but sometimes they even create new opportunities or new incentives or new innovative ways for being corrupt. Yeah. So the next slide. So I won't go through this because both Joy and Mambo spoke about them, but this is just to highlight the fact that yes, there is something that is being done legally. We do have legal framework. We see the problem and we're trying to act on it. Yeah. So next slide. And so why isn't this acting? Why isn't this legislature working? So in as much as we, the citizens, abhor corruption, we are unlikely to monitor and act against corruption because many of these anti-corruption reforms require us, the citizens, to enforce the laws. So it's what other speakers have spoken about, the fact that we need to whistleblow. We need to be the ones to report anti-corruption things. But why are we unlikely to report them? The first thing is that we are unlikely because it is risky in terms of a whistleblower is not sure of their safety in Kenya. A whistleblower doesn't know if what they go and whistleblow will actually be changed, will actually be taken anywhere, because the people we're reporting to are the same ones who are supposed to implement the legislature. Yeah. And the second thing is that there's low trust to everybody that as I, the citizen, are meant to go out and enforce these legislation by whistleblowing, for example. There's really short-term gains that I know, and we see it many times in Kenya when we find that somebody has been caught in a very corrupt way. We know it's only a short time before they're released. Yes, so we don't see the follow-through. What happens after that? Yes, this big person or this police officer was caught taking a bribe, but they're out on the streets the next day. So there's no motivation for us to actually go and report corruption. So next slide, please. Yeah, so we find perhaps the problem, and I think this was spoken about by Dr. Gikonya and Professor Shehu, that we are trying to implement a one-size-fits-all, that while corruption is generic, it's everywhere in the world, there isn't a generic solution. There are differences in cultural beliefs and value system and norms. So what is appropriate in one society or in one country is inappropriate in another country. So anti-corruption and compliance effects, they usually use a factor approach, which relies on a checklist of actions or components that need to be included. So this generic nature ignores the contextual difference where this legislature is being put in place. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Apologies, Sandra, but I'm the bad guy of this conference.
I have just one last slide and I'm done, I promise.
I am truly grateful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Yes. The last slide, yeah. So the anti-corruption program, yes, we need to take into account the factors, like we're being sensitive to differences in local circumstances, that how corruption in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is tackled is different to how corruption in different parts of Asia or Eastern Europe, which is far more systematic, is encountered. So if an anti-corruption program does not take these differences into account, we'll find that success at best will be limited. So thank you, Ross. I'm done. This is the last slide, and thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you, Sandra. The person that I neglected to introduce, and I apologize to him, is Chinedum Akpala. Dr. Akpala is a lecturer at Nottingham Trent, recently left University of Law at Birmingham, research interests in money laundering, prosecutorial discretion, legal ethics, corruption, etc. So I do apologize, Chinedum, for that oversight. Who's next?
Do you want me to go on?
Evelyn, I'd like you to go on, and we'll ask Dr. Akpala to present at the end.
This presentation is moved by looking at issues of law in practice on asset forfeiture, and the work in progress really to look at exploring issues from a socio-legal perspective, considering the issues of IFS in illicit financial flows and the issue of sustainable development in African countries. So I'm moved to look at the non-conviction based forfeiture mechanism as a practical asset recovery mechanism for African countries. Next slide, please. Now, forfeiture basically talked about the vesting of criminal assets or unlawful assets from the hands of criminals or offenders. So this will include cash, include personal property and real estate. So crime here refers to all criminal offenses, unlawful activities prescribed by law. Now, we're looking at financial crime here. So that will be fraud, narcotic drug trafficking, money laundering, embezzlement, bribery, and looting. So there are basically three types of forfeiture actions that we could take, and that will be criminal forfeiture, which is a personal action that is taken against an offender with intention of recovering illicit assets upon the conviction of the offender. It requires the presence of the offender. It requires a standard of proof which is beyond reasonable doubt. Now, this mechanism is quite costly, and there are delay issues, especially in African countries, in any country actually, but there are issues in tracing, freezing, and forfeiting these assets, especially after going through a long process of trying to convict them. The approach here is a punitive approach, which is basically to fine them, imprison them, and forfeit their assets upon their conviction. So another of the criminal code then executes the penalties under the criminal code or the procedural rules of the individual countries. Next slide, please. Civil forfeiture is basically the appropriation by the state of unlawful assets from illegal activity. So it's directed at the property itself. This is a less stringent action. It's on balance of probabilities. It targets the property itself, not the offender. So it's more of a restorative or compensatory approach, which goes to provide remedies of restoration to the victims harmed by crime, to compensate them, basically. So there are different types of evil actions that one could take, which would be, there's some where you look at the private civil actions where, private litigants can bring civil proceedings in jurisdictions where the offender resides or where the illicit assets are located. There's also the administrative forfeiture action, which we could take, which is a non-judicial process that aims to seize assets. This is based on the probable cause that they're subject to forfeiture. Next slide, please. Now, there is a global consensus on recovering the proceeds of crime. With lots of speakers here today have talked about illicit financial flows. My concern here is illicit financial flows from Africa. There's a major agenda with the international community, the regional bodies, in trying to ensure the confiscation of assets that are stored in, that have been transited abroad, trying to recover them back. Africa has faced drainage of capital and has a huge consequences on the development of the region itself. So we have had initiatives from the United Nations, from the UNCAC, Against Corruption, the Financial Action Task Force. We've got the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, which promotes the effective recovery of assets using helping developing countries with their asset recovery efforts, really. So we have the regional effort with the African Union, with the African Union Convention on Preventing Corruption. But these basically, why I make reference to these initiatives is to look specifically at the provisions on asset forfeiture. And I'm looking at Article 54.1c of the UNCAC and the Article 16 of the AUC, which refers to a non-conventional based forfeiture mechanism as an additional or an alternative mechanism to recovering the process of crime. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Now, the NCBF mechanism has its benefits. Its process is to divest illicit profits, to take them out of the hands of offenders. So it reduces the incentives to engage in unlawful activities, in the sense that it serves as a deterrence to corrupt acts or criminal acts. So efforts at recovering using the mechanism kind of increase, more assets are recovered or forfeited or repatriated to countries. Also, recovered assets could be used to benefit victims, which can help in the sustainable development goals of African countries in poverty reduction programs. Now, there are countries that have actually have well-developed asset forfeiture mechanisms, like the US and the United Kingdom. But in Africa, we do have some countries that have well-developed criminal and civil forfeiture mechanism, but this is not without its issues. South Africa, for instance, Kenya has both criminal and civil forfeiture measures. Now, the focus of this presentation today is to look at the implementation and enforcement challenges in utilizing this mechanism in Africa. I'm looking at it from the stakeholders' perspective, because I find out that there is a serious scarcity of literature in this area, particularly within the context of cultural issues. Looking at it from why can't we effectively recover assets? So looking at the weak institutions, governance systems, and mechanisms which contribute greatly to asset recovery in practice. So I would, due to time, I will look at just law enforcement perspective on recovering assets. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. The essence of looking at South Africa, Kenya, and Zambia is to kind of compare, because my focus was Nigeria is yet to implement this mechanism. Now, South Africa has a mechanism in place. To start with, these countries have asset forfeiture framework. So one of the laws is, for South Africa, for instance, is the Prevention of Organized Crime Act of 1998, the Kenya, the Process of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2009, and Zambia, the Forfeiture of the Process of Crime 2010. Now, all these acts provide for the criminal and civil forfeiture of assets. Next slide, please. With Nigeria, we do not currently have a civil forfeiture mechanism, but there are mechanisms that we can recover assets. We go through the criminal law process, which is quite tedious, and we have issues with that. Nigeria has been trying to implement a civil forfeiture mechanism under the Process of Crime law, which was proposed since 2009, and this being ongoing now for over 10 years now. Current president has proposed the Proceeds of Crime Bill, which is the 2019 bill. But interestingly, the 2017 almost got, was before him for assent, but I don't know why he didn't approve it, though there were issues of, I've forgotten, I'll come back to that. But there were issues with bringing it into, enacting it into law. So we have the 2019, which is before the Legislative House. Now, with comparing this Proceeds of Crime Bill and the enactment in South Africa, Kenya, and Zambia, I want to look at the NCBF mechanism. The objective of this mechanism is basically the same, and that is to deprive offenders of the financial benefit or profit of their crimes. Now, this bill proposed to provide the restraint, seizure, confiscation, forfeiture of property derived from unlawful activities and all instrumentalities used or intended to be used in the commission of crime. Next slide, please.
Evelyn, I apologize because this is an issue of particular interest to me, having been an expert witness in a civil forfeiture proceeding in the US, but I have to give you 2 more minutes and then we'll.
All right, then.
I know you have a lot more interesting things to cover. Thank you.
Okay, I looked at the implementation and enforcement challenges. I looked at, okay, I'll focus on the crypto assets. I noticed that there's no provision on crypto assets. And this is quite a serious lack in the law, in short, in all the laws actually, because crypto assets is basically about, is a property for forfeiture. But governments have not actually regulated, there's limited government control. If we know how crypto assets are, they are anonymous in nature. So there's need to look at this area and make provisions on that, the legislation. Now, there's a case I want to refer to quickly, and that's the Eon Science case, which just came up. It's unreported, and it doesn't have much authority, but it shows that the courts are quite flexible at looking at crypto assets and trying to locate in terms of worldwide freezing orders and placing an injunction on trying to recover assets, crypto assets. So I think there is need for governments in African countries to look at making provisions on crypto assets in legislations on proceeds of crime. Now, enforcement, this is another problem with enforcement challenges. It's the enforcement authority says the lack of the capacity and the resources in carrying out their functions. Capacity in the sense that skills and development, resources, inadequate resources to fund the activities, in the management of recovered assets or forfeited assets in this case. Especially when we understand that the purpose of forfeiture of assets is to use these assets to probably benefit victims and take them out of the hands of offenders. Next slide, please. I also looked at the proportionality and constitutionality of the NCBF mechanism, the civil forfeiture mechanism. There's need to balance the need to recover assets and the need to take it from the hands of offenders. Now, look at the property rights, because under the Constitution, everyone has the right to property, the right to not be, but there's a way the act has been defined under Section 94 of the Kenya's Act, 30 of the Zambian Act, and the South African Act, which provides for the exclusion of interest in property. That is, there's a defense to those that have a genuine bona fide defense to those with interest in properties. I looked at also the presumption of innocence. Now, I know this is about civil forfeiture, but in issues of evidence, in trying to defend your right to properties, you need to present evidence. So there's need for law enforcement to balance the right to provide evidence and the right to protect your property. Next slide, please. So in all, I just want to talk about
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Hello?
Sorry to interrupt, but can I ask you to round up in the next 1 minute, please?
Yes, I'm doing that now. This is the last slide. We need law reform in this area, especially in Nigeria, in trying to implement a new civil forfeiture mechanism. So we need comprehensive and updated provisions in assets forfeiture practice. We need legislation on cryptocurrency that will take cognizance of the updates in the use of cryptocurrency in crime, in financial crime. Now, there's need to have a comprehensive policy framework on delivering asset recovery objectives, transparency and accountability, access to information, recording, auditing, increase capacity and resourcing assets for future practice. And it's also important to recruit experts and skills of these experts to be able to handle civil forfeiture or NCBF mechanisms in practice. Lastly, I just want to talk about all issues I didn't really discuss, which is issues of law enforcement in practice, in trust, in sharing information of citizens, which we've discussed. Many speakers have talked about that, whistleblowing. These are issues that need to be addressed in actually enforcing an effective and successful NCBF mechanism in African countries. Thank you very much.
Evelyn, thanks very much. We'll come back to Chinedum. We'll ask him to spend 5 minutes tops, and I apologize, but we are the last panel and you are the last speaker. So, because then we still need to take questions. Please start.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so when discussing this topic, most of us tend to focus more on other typologies, you know, of money laundering related offenses. But, you know, some of us have also acknowledged, you know, the corruption related angle of money laundering and the side effects of this. But first, let's discuss who a PEP is. Who is a PEP? A PEP is, you know, someone who is holding public office, prominent public office. That's who a PEP is generally. And so, if you're holding public office and you abuse public office, okay, by engaging in corruption, bribery, you know, stealing government funds, thereby depriving, you know, the citizens and people who should enjoy their rights, basically, then it can actually affect a lot of other things. It can affect development, it can affect security, it can affect lifestyle, it can affect, you know, our general well-being. The FATF has tried to define who PEP is, but I wouldn't generally think that a PEP is someone who is high-end, you know, holding a high-end political office. Anyone who's holding public office is also a politically exposed person. So I don't want to delve into that line of argument now because of time. Now, what role does the rule of law play when discussing issues, you know, of prosecuting PEPs successfully? First of all, let me show you this. The rule of law is central to the criminal justice system of any nation. Okay. Now, in Nigeria, so I'm going to focus on this discussion on Nigeria. In Nigeria, the criminal justice system, okay, is centered around the office of the Attorney General. The Attorney General in itself, or whoever the person is a politically exposed person. Okay, and all over the world, you can't have a functional criminal justice system, all right, without the rule of law. Okay, and so money laundering itself is falls under, you know, the criminal justice system, all right. So the AML regime falls under the criminal justice system, all right. The prosecutors fall under the administration of the criminal justice system. The AML regulatory agencies in Nigeria, like the EFCC, the ICPC, the NFIUs, you know, the CBN, Department of Money Laundering, the CBN, all fall under the criminal justice system, okay? But the funny part of this is that this criminal justice system, okay, is regulated by somebody. Not regulated by somebody, it's regulated by the Constitution, okay, which actually, and of course, other extant laws, you know, the Criminal Procedure Act, Criminal Procedure Code, the ACJA, Administration of Criminal Justice Act, all right? But most importantly, the Office of the Attorney General, okay? Most importantly, the Office of the Attorney General, and that is where the problem lies. Why does the problem lie around this area? It's because the problem of developing nations facing the corruption-related typology in Nigeria is not the absence of a strong AML-CFT regulatory framework, but the absence of a criminal justice system centered on the rule of law. Now, what do I mean by an absence of the criminal justice system centered on the rule of law? There's a tendency that when your entire criminal justice system, okay, is centered around an office or the administration of an office, okay, there might be a tendency of abusing executive powers or prosecutorial powers, okay, even as it relates to money laundering related offenses and the typology of corruption. Now, many legal scholars have made positive attempts in expanding the rule of law. Notable Aristotle, Evidice, Tom Baham, Lon Fuller. Most of this discussion, I would shed more light on Lon Fuller. Okay, integrates the 8 principles of Fuller's moralities of law, okay, and applies to the AML regime in Nigeria and how it has affected the successful prosecution of politically exposed persons or non-successful prosecution, as the case may be. So Fuller believes that the rule of law must be internalized and accepted by members of the society. So in other words, you must have set rules, okay? You must have set rules. The rules must also be generally applicable, all right? Now, in the Nigerian AML regime, okay, particularly when it comes to prosecuting of money laundering related offenses, it appears that prosecution of other typology of money laundering offenses like cybercrime, for example, appears to be successful. Okay, drugs and narcotics appears to be successful. All right, but the prosecution of politically exposed persons, and this typology is actually has a more far-reaching effect in terms of the negative far-reaching effect on the society. Okay, is it as successful or is nothing to write home about? And why? Because it appears we have different set rules. Okay, that aren't generally applicable. And so these are some of the issues, which we hope to discuss. But because of time, I might not be able to go into full details. All right. Now, when applying discretionary techniques, for example, we're talking about generality of laws. Okay, discretionary techniques, notice of discontinuance, for example, applying plea bargaining laws, for example, okay, with regards to money laundering related offenses and corruption related offenses. It appears the EFCC and the ICPC and other AML regulatory bodies, okay, are in a hurry to negotiate, okay, and apply these discretionary techniques, okay, with politically exposed persons. All right, and then at the end of the day, we have little or no success, all right, in actually carrying out an effective AML regime, all right, with regards to the prosecution of politically exposed persons. And so you ask yourself, why are we engaging in so many plea bargains, all right, or why are we actually having overcharging? Now, when you look at the charge sheet, why would you be charging? Which takes me to the next slide. Why would you overcharging or charging somebody who has actually been in public office, a politically exposed person who has abused his office, okay, with 100 and something count charge? All right. Let's not forget that money laundering itself, okay, is a criminal offense, right? And if we go by the main definition of money laundering, all right, it's a process of crime, right? And so if it's a process of crime, it means that money laundering is a baby offense. In other words, there must be a parent offense for you to successfully prosecute for money laundering. Now, if you have to prosecute a politically exposed person successfully, it might be difficult, all right, for you to prosecute successfully on the money laundering charge, but it might be easier for you to prosecute on the parent offense. So what do I mean by that? If I'm in government, let's say I'm a governor or I'm a minister or I'm a government chief executive or something, okay, and I abuse my office, all right? The fact that I have abused my office, what have I done? I've committed breach of public trust. Yes, it's as simple as it is. And the Criminal Procedure Act makes provisions for this. And so do I necessarily need to overcharge by putting all forms of money laundering counts, okay, in the charge sheet and making it very cumbersome and unrealistic for me to successfully prosecute? These are some of the issues, okay, which falls under the ethical consideration of prosecutors in the AML regime. And it's actually a rule of law issue. I would explain how it's all linked to the rule of law. Now, if you have a more transparency approach, if prosecutors and AML regulatory agencies are more transparent, okay, your charge sheets will be open to the public, okay, people will be able to make contributions, okay, if the independence of the prosecutors are sacrosanct, okay, then it will be easier and more transparent, okay, for the prosecutors to actually carry out their job. Now, the Office of the Attorney General, by virtue of law, okay, puts everything at the doorstep of the AG. Now, subsection 3 of section 174 of the 1999 Constitution makes an attempt to create a leeway for the rule of law to come in. So I'm using the word intentionally, makes an attempt in the sense that it says, look, the AG must act in the interest of the public, all right, when applying discretionary powers like non-prosecution. Okay, sorry.
I apologize for interrupting, but can I ask you to conclude your final points in 1 minute, just so that we can move to the question section? I do apologize. 1 minute, please. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So, some of the problems that we have, like I said earlier, lack of transparency of the regulatory agencies, which is a rule of law issue, transparency of the independence of prosecutors, which is also failure of the integration of rule of law in the AML regime, abuse of prosecutorial discretion by AML regulatory agencies, overcharging, for example, which we talked about, not having the opportunity to apply flexibility of charges or intentionally not doing so, a strict application of deontological ethics, so ethical consideration of gatekeepers here, lawyers, and people who actually should do their jobs in this regard, and also looking at it from a virtue ethics point of view as against a deontological ethics point of view. The challenge of the Constitution, Section 174, which concentrates all the powers of the AG, you know, and gives the AG exclusive rights to regulate the prosecutorial powers. And of course, FATF and GABA not asking the right questions, in the sense that because of the transplantation of laws, and then it looks as if we have an effective AML regime, which we do, all right, but with regards to the typology, which is prevalent in Nigeria, we are not as effective as we should be. So we have a lot of action going on, a lot of prosecution of politically exposed persons going on. But the real question should be, how many people have you successfully convicted? How many politically exposed persons have you successfully convicted? So these are the issues, you know, which center around the application of rule of law, you know, and if we look at Fuller's 8 principles, which I attempt to mention earlier, for clarity of laws, for the application of generality of laws, and the congruence of how these laws are formed and how they are applied, it's quite interesting, and I hope these issues can be subsequently addressed within the Nigerian AML region.
Dr. Opala, I must ask you to now conclude your presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
So, my recommendation basically is that we should have a transparent application of prosecutorial discretion in the prosecution of an application of rule of law in applying these prosecutorial techniques by prosecuting politically exposed persons. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very insightful presentations. I am so sorry that we have run over time and not had the chance to take all of the questions. I think we can share maybe just 1 or 2 questions. I wonder if Nisha can share her screen. Yes, fantastic, great. So we can only take maybe 1 question because we are really running behind time. But I think what we might do is when we send out our general email, we may then ask our presenters to just answer those questions, and we can attach that in an email for you. So I'll just take one of the questions, one that has 2 likes. Should the regulation of anti-money laundering be solely the responsibility of government organizations? Perhaps I'll ask Dr. Azinge if you are available. I think your presentation touched on some of these issues. Perhaps you can share some insights in 1 minute. Dr. Azinge? Dr. Constance, are you available to answer 1 question? Are you happy to answer this? There's a question specifically for you. So
yes.
Yes, we can. There's a question for you specifically. So if you can answer that question in 1 minute.
Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Jinkono, for an explicit view of Phil's Africans. I could immediately repeat your views which apply to developing countries. I wanted to share one thing in addition to that, please.
Okay.
Dr. Constance, can you
I think
hear
that
us?
one was even more of a comment than a question. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay. Please, how will culture impact the development? Okay, I've seen the question now.
It was a comment, and I just wondered whether you wanted to share anything on top of it before I wrap up. That I asked.
Yes, I would. I would say that culture, we need to.
So, is there any just share a comment?
Yes, and I'm saying that with regards to culture. With regards to culture, we need to change our attitude to wealth. How we attain this wealth would be important and would point us in the right direction, so that it's not just a matter of making money, however, so long as you're rich. But have you made it in the right way? Is it clean money? Or are you outrightly involved in some illegal activity, and that is how you have gained your money, yet we still hold you up as a morally upright member of society?